So I've kind of divided this up into several things. There's a story with the dog. I want you to think about this. It's a good story. Now, I don't want the truth to get in the way of a good story.
Yeah, right. Hello, and welcome to Galveston Unscripted. In this episode today, I sit down with George Osborne to discuss a little bit about World War II history here in Galveston. George is a history enthusiast, a retired history teacher, and he gives some pretty amazing tours here on the island. Now, believe it or not, Mr. George Osborne is kind of an inspiration for Galveston Unscripted. A few years ago, as I was doing research online about Galveston's history, I stumbled upon galveston.com and their video history series featuring Mr. George Osborne. These videos were recorded in the 2010s, but I highly recommend you go to galveston.com and check out their video series. George and Lee from galveston.com collaborated with the Rosenberg Library and explored Galveston's history through a video series, a lot like I'm doing today. And if you haven't checked out their video series, I highly recommend it. Check the link in the description. Over the past few years, George and I would run into each other at coffee shops, and we would sit down and have lengthy discussions about history. Not just Galveston history, but history in general. And I always knew I wanted to get him on the podcast. George was kind enough to come into the studio, sit down with me, and discuss a lot about Galveston's World War II history. We dive into some information and stories about German U-boats in the Gulf of Mexico in 1942 and 1943 during World War II. We also touch on various topics related to the early 1940s here in Galveston, with a heavy focus on World War II. If you haven't yet, go check out the video I put together on German U-boats in the Gulf of Mexico. That video includes portions of this interview where George helps me tell the story of those German U-boats right off the coast of Galveston. Without further ado, let's hop right into this episode with Mr. George Osborne, discussing World War II and Galveston. Welcome to Galveston Unscripted. George, thank you so much for joining me on Galveston Unscripted.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
This was probably 5, 6, 7 years ago when I started researching a little bit of Galveston history. Of course, I would read the historical plaques and things like that, but getting online, I would search something specific like the Galveston Causeway or the Battle of Galveston, and there were videos that popped up of you with Lee with galveston.com, and you guys did kind of a whole video series on history, right?
We did. That was a lot of fun, and you could still see those, I think, on galveston.com. So, yeah, that was a lot of fun doing with those and research, and he tied in with the Rosenberg Library a lot, and yeah, so that was a great time.
So you're kind of the original Galveston Unscripted. You're like the original, right?
Yes. Yeah, well, thank you. I wouldn't call myself that, but, sure.
So you're my inspiration.
I'll own that.
Yeah, you're my inspiration for it. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up here in this seat today? No.
Well, I've always been a history nut. I don't know where that came from. I guess my father was a World War II vet. He was interested in history. My grandfather on the other side was an Italian. He was an immigrant. So I think that's part of it. And then I was always interested in history. When the Elissa first got here, I was on the original volunteer crew for that. Wow. And just that's what brought me to Galveston. I've always loved the history of it, good stories, the good human stories. So I did that for a while, and then I taught history, and then I was a seasonal park ranger for National Park Service around the country. So that's always love hanging with those people, some very knowledgeable people. Bunch of history nerds. You want people to get away from you, you start talking history.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
They'll move away.
Yeah, but you attract the people who are actually interested.
Yeah.
Talking about it.
Yeah.
So you were a history teacher. What grade did you teach? What were you?
Junior high.
Okay.
Junior high.
And what aspect of history were you teaching?
Did Texas history a lot, and then some American history too.
That's great. I love that. And so the park ranger, you were moving all over the place to be a park ranger in different parts of the country, right?
Right. I was seasonal ranger, so, usually summer. So that was pretty interesting work, and learned a lot from all kind of interesting people. I worked at a park. It was a Paleo Indian park. So a lot of the Rangers there could make arrowheads out of I have no idea how to do that, but it was really cool to watch them and learn their skills and just see how people lived before Europeans got here. Mm-hmm. And then I worked at several other places too.
We're going to do back-to-back episodes today, and the first one we're going to hop into is a little bit of history on World War II.
Right. I want to tell you now, this is oral history backed up by research. Now, this story was told me by a guy named Judge Roy Engelkey. He was from Galveston, really one heck of a guy. And so he was telling me this. When Roy was about World War II, Roy is about 10 years old. So when he tells me this story, he's telling me, it's a 10-year-old telling me. He's, when people remember childhood stuff.
Yeah.
So Roy's uncle, this is early World War II, 1942. Roy's uncle was Gus Darnell. He was a captain of a Likes line ship. Now, I want you to think about that for a bit. If you're a 10-year-old, wouldn't that be too cool to have your uncle as a captain of a ship?
Yeah.
I mean, that's just like, wow, So Roy's uncle, Captain Darnell, there's a ship called the Tilly, not the Tilly Likes, but the Cardonia, his first ship. Now, 1942, this place would have been wartime. There were blackouts. There were ships pulling in here that had been damaged out there in the ocean, the thing. There would have been a whole buzz about what's going on out of there, from the seamen coming in here, the Norwegian seamen here, the English seamen, the American. There would have been a buzz going on, and there would have been a lot of concern and a lot of fearful, because there were articles in newspapers that were not true about German submarine bases in Mexico, secret bases. That was a big fear, and legitimately so. So Roy's uncle, he's out on the Cardonia. So they are attacked one morning. This is, March 42, early in the war, a few months after Pearl Harbor. There's a German submarine on the surface. Now, I want you to think about how bold that is during the day that U-boat is on the surface. They sink another ship within sight of the Cardonia.
Oh, wow.
The Cardonia is trying to get away. Now, these are not fast ships. These U-boats can really move on the surface. So they start chasing the Cardonia. This is during the daylight. And Cardonia makes smoke, weaves back and forth. Submarine fires 52 shots at them out of their deck gun over about a period of an hour and a half.
Oh, my God.
Now, I want you to think, if you were standing on the deck of the Cardonia and these Germans are firing this gun at you, and the noise, the smoke, the fear, and they will actually hit the Cardonia and eventually knocks out the power. The order to abandon ship is given. There was one man killed. They abandon the ship. The submarine pulls up, shoots a couple more into the hull to sink the ship. God. Now, think about this. These guys are in this lifeboat watching.
Yeah.
They're helpless. Germans will come over. They will, now later in the war, this would not happen. But they give them some water. They give them a compass bearing to Haiti, which is about 15 miles away, just a little bit over the horizon, so they can get that. And in this boat is the captain's dog. So the captain's dog is named DM for damn mess. Captain Darnell gets his dog, DM, which is short for damn mess. And the dog has been grown up on shipboard the whole time. They come back, he will come back to Galveston and give Roy that dog. he says, Roy, it's getting a little dangerous out there. I'm afraid to take the dog back out there. So he gives it to Roy, and the dog had one of these things. When he would come up to the door, he would jump over it. Remember watertight chip doors?
Yeah.
So the dog would come up, and he'd always jump just in the house. He would just jump. That was his thing. And he was apparently a real nice dog, and Roy had him for a while. Well, Captain Darnell, he goes back out just as a couple months later on a ship called the Likes. And from Roy's account, never shows up again. They don't know what happened to the ship. They assume it was sunk by U-boat. Now, later after the war, the records are all put together, and the Likes get sunk by German submarine, essentially in the same waters, and there is no survivors. And so that's how Roy told me this story. Now, DM, I was like, what happened to DM? And he later would get run over by a car.
Oh, no.
But he was a little older, but I always thought, that interesting story of how this little dog survived a U-boat attack.
Yeah.
And Roy's story, when he told me that, I mean, it was very emotional, when he told me. So that's one of the interesting stories I find out of all that.
That is fascinating. And it was sunk right off of the coast of Haiti. Right
off the coast of Haiti. And you can find the coordinates and stuff is on there. There's pictures of those ships. Likes Line had an office here in Galveston. And Likes Line had a big office in New Orleans, and that was a big player in merchant ships, really for a good part of the 20th century.
Yeah, and that's an interesting aspect of history that I think here in Galveston we may not really think about too much, is that there were ships leaving here and coming to the port of Galveston who were going through those kind of naval choking points, between Haiti and the coast of Florida, or somewhere in that area, and they would get sunk by German U-boats, and they were afraid.
There were tremendous amount of ships. Now, one of the things I know Roy liked to do back in '94, over at Pier 21, there is a monument they put up for 50 years after D-Day. And it shows there that ships sunk in the Gulf of Mexico and the Bahamas, and there's dots on there for that's very moving. When you go look at it, it's like, oh, man, look at all these ships. A lot of ships, a lot of crews. So it's pretty sad things. And we have very few monuments to our merchant marines that were lost.
So earlier in your story, you mentioned blackouts. So I learned about blackouts not from Galveston, but when I went to Pearl Harbor last year, they talked about how they would black out the island. They would turn all the lights off. So why would they turn the lights off here in Galveston?
Well, the reason they're doing that, just like the problem is if there are submarines out there, the enemy, and a ship comes between at night, between the lights and the submarine, it silhouettes that ship. They had a big problem with that on the East Coast. They didn't turn the lights out, and they lost a whole bunch of merchant ships that way. So that's why you want to black the city out for those sort of things. And again, we don't know how many U-boats are out there at any time. You know, in hindsight, it probably didn't, but hindsight's okay to look at. We're looking at, my God, how many U-boats are out there? Do they have planes in Mexico at hidden secret air bases? So that's part of the deal. There are citizen groups that I talked to a woman, her father had been a volunteer beach guy, and they would sit out there on the beach with binoculars and look for German submarines.
Wow.
And of course, you can imagine the fear. Anything's going to look like a German submarine. Any piece of debris, possibly. Now, I read one story where it was a mop with a handle floating around. It's somebody looked like a periscope. Wouldn't look like one to me.
Everything looks like a U-boat.
If I'm a mile or two away, and it's like, holy moly.
Yeah.
That would be pretty frightening.
There's a newspaper article, I believe it's in the Galveston Daily News or one of the older Houston newspapers, there was a tugboat running from Galveston to Freeport to go assist the ship over in Freeport during World War II. And as the tug is making its way over to Freeport, they spot a submarine or a U-boat right maybe a mile away from, off the coast, because they're only maybe half a mile to a mile running over to Freeport. And the captain said, whatever happens, I'm not going to allow this German U-boat to take over this tug, but all I've got is a .22 caliber rifle.
It's like these they are unarmed vessels.
Yeah.
If they did have a weapon on it, sometimes the Naval Armed Guard, they would put these, but this was some of these old cannons that had been set in front of the VFW from World War I. They put on these ships, so it was a very, very dangerous situation for merchant seamen and anybody out there. Mm-hmm. Now, just a other note on these two U-boats that sunk, the Cardonia and then the Tilly Likes. They would be lost later in the war with all hands. So they did not survive the war either. Now, another story I'll tell you. Now, this comes from a guy named Ballinger Mills. In fact, his office was in this building.
Oh, really?
Mills Shirley.
Okay, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, interesting man, and I would know him just by chatting with him. So he told me this story. Now, during World War II, he is a Navy officer, and he is stationed in New Orleans. And the FBI comes by to the office and says, Mr. Mills, we need to see you in Galveston almost immediately. So he got the first train over here. Now, he was released, the Navy, this is the FBI. This is J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. FBI, come and talk to you. So they came over to the house. He met his wife at the house. These FBI guy said, Mr. Mills, we want to rent a room in your house. Can't tell you why. We just want to rent this upstairs room. He goes, how much will that cost us? And Ballinger goes, $1. He said the FBI man opened his wallet and gave him $1. Mm. So he goes back on. So later, a few months later, his wife calls him and says, they're gone. FBI guys are gone. Now, the FBI man would come by in New Orleans and goes, Mr. Mills, he goes, you cannot tell this till after the war. This is a secret, but we were in your home. We respect that. You just have to know why we were in there. So they suspected across from his house, there was a German who worked at the beer brewery down here, the Falstaff Brewery. Mm-hmm. He was one of the brewmasters. Now, they suspected him of having an antenna in his house, and the way Ballinger described it was that it was a big house that this antenna supposedly ran from the bottom up to the deal. Far as we know, nothing happens. So part 2 to this story is, I see an article in the paper one day, this is, 20 years ago maybe, and a guy is looking for, does anybody know any stories about this kind of thing? So I call him up and he meets me. I'm telling him this story, and when I say the FBI and I'm telling him, he gets focused right in on me. He is like giving me this look. So I finish his story, and he goes, well, I've been to the FBI, the researched this whole story. Now, I don't know what to think. Now, I don't know for a fact. I don't believe that the guy had an antenna, but considering the time, people are scared. People are frightening. They're gathering up Japanese, or they're gathering up Italians. They're gathering up German nationals. They're having people to move off the coast. Joe DiMaggio's father, who was an Italian, had to move. He had a fishing business in San Francisco. He had to move off the coast. So that's the climate we're in on this stuff. So there's a lot of mythology about this. There's a lot of frightening stuff that happens. You can see in our own time, people are frightened in different groups. And that's what's going on there. Now, a couple other myths that I think. Now, I want you to think about this, though, too. Just think if that radio was there. Now, considering 1940s technology, he would have had to send it to a U-boat here, and it just doesn't quite seem to be able to work. Now, another myth that I've heard is and I heard this from somebody who worked at the Galvez. Now, I want you to think about this. It's a good story. Now, I don't want the truth to get in the way of a good story.
Yeah, right.
But somebody had told that there was an old German guy who came there, and he goes, we had our submarine right off the shore. We could hear the band playing at night. Now, that's a good story, isn't it?
They could hear the band playing?
Yeah, they were that close. But now think about this. It's pretty shallow right over. There's no place you would want to come in with a U-boat. Now you're going to have to hear that. The south wind is blowing the opposite way. Don't let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Yeah.
So those are kind of one of the other things. There was a couple other things I wrote down. Now this is also, there was, heard this from Nagoya, there's a whole lot of Italian shrimp boats here. So they are actually coming down. Later there will be a federal agent. I got to get some more detail on that. But the rumor is that these Italian shrimp boats are going off rendezvousing with German U-boats. Remember, Italy is an ally of Germany, and giving them diesel fuel. But think about this a little bit. Number one, how much diesel fuel does a 1940 shrimp boat have?
Probably not much.
Not much. Then you would have had to rendezvous at sea with a German submarine off. It's a good story, but it's also based in fear. It's a climate of fear. We can all understand how that goes. There was a federal agent, and we'll talk about this, a guy named Al Scharf, who had been involved in arresting smugglers and stuff back then. And he came down to investigate that. And as far as I can find, there was no truth to that. But they investigate all these rumors. So that's one of the deals.
I mean, the best they could do, even if they could rendezvous in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, which would be very difficult in the 1940s without they didn't have the equipment we have now.
No.
The best they could do was maybe give them some food.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it.
That's the best they could do.
Yeah. Some provisions, some shrimp. Here you go. Have a shrimp boil on the U-boat.
So those, but it is, now it almost kind of seems silly, but at the time, you got to think about, people were terrified. Ships were disappearing. Casualty lists were gone. It's a pretty difficult situation. And especially when you're reading these stories in newspapers about, German spies, and Hollywood's making these movies about German spies. And so, I could see that would be pretty scary.
Yeah.
But again, think about, we are involved. When I say we, Galveston, this part of Texas, we got military bases here. We got a blimp flying around looking for submarines. We got an air base here that's training people. We got Fort Crockett. There's a lot of military activity here. Lots of military activity. Ships going out.
So it would have been the prime spot for spies.
For sure would have been.
Especially, like you mentioned, you got the blimp, the air base, you got the coastal artillery, you have all that. So, and not to mention a heavy German population.
Yes.
In this part of Texas.
Yeah.
So it's very plausible that there's some messages getting back to Germany about what was going on.
It is, and they did round up German nationals and put them into a prison camp.
Mm-hmm.
There was a big prison camp down in South Texas, had some Japanese, Germans, and some Italian nationals.
Mm-hmm.
So those are pretty frightening.
Yeah. And what's interesting, a lot of people don't realize there were POW camps here on the island and in Bolivar as well.
Yes.
And I'm sure right across the causeway up in the mainland as well.
Yes. There were German POWs here at Fort Crockett. There were some over there, and they would tend to have them doing, they would, do the laundry or work in the kitchen, that sort of stuff. They were doing those sort of things that they just needed.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember talking to some old guys who are younger than I am now, by the way. But then they were children. They lived right behind Fort Crockett. And so the Germans would come up and talk to them. Some of them could speak English pretty well. And they would talk to these boys. Mm-hmm. Some of these Germans, they weren't that old. They were teens, mm-hmm. early 20s. So that was a very memorable thing to them.
Yeah, I mean, how fascinating would that be? Just, growing up in Galveston, you're a kid, maybe 12, 13, walking up to the fence, seeing a guy who's just a few years older than you who'd been captured in Germany.
Yeah.
And I wonder what that exchange would have been like.
Yeah, it must have been real interesting because you would have had an older brother. Yeah. You would have had cousins that were in the U.S. military. So, mm-hmm. There's a whole lot of thoughts on that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting, and especially... Even though you have a fence in between you, it kind of makes it more personal. It's a personable exchange. It's weird. Yeah. And I heard that there were some German POWs who actually, when they were released, they actually moved back to Texas.
We had a whole lot of German POWs and Italian POWs up here. There was, and Texas had a bunch of them because the weather was nice. They needed hands for farming. Up in the Panhandle, I visited a site when I was up there, and the Italian, there were 30,000 of them there. Now it's just a field, and they had built a chapel that the Knights of Columbus still maintains, and it's a little bitty chapel out there, out down a dirt road, but it's just kind of cool when you think about all this sadness of World War II going on, and hear these guys out here, and then the local Catholic priest would come out and do mass for them and stuff.
And those guys were POWs, or
they were POWs? They were Italians.
Wow.
And they painted. I'm trying to remember. They painted a fresco at the local Catholic church.
Of course they did. They're Italian.
Yeah, they're Italians. And the big thing, they couldn't pay them, but they could feed them. So they'd have a big feast over there for these Italian guys, and some of them would stay or come back.
Yeah, what a fascinating aspect of history.
Mm-hmm.
What a fascinating, it's kind of interesting. Like here on the grounds in the United States, you had internment camps, for the Japanese and some Germans, but then you had POW camps. So it's just interesting how fear really ran a lot here in the United States, especially on the internment side. But then you hear about the POWs who moved back to the United States or even just stayed here.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting aspect of America's history.
Yeah. Something it gets overshadowed a lot by the bigger events of World War II, but I think it's an interesting human story also for that. I worked with a guy many years ago, and he was in the American Navy, and there was a POW camp nearby, and later toward the end of the war, they would come by and drop the same German soldiers off to work on your farm. Mm-hmm. And they made friends with about 3 of these guys. They were their farm hands. And they had them over for Christmas, when they did. And I could see that because his parents, they had a son that was about the same age that was off in the war. And here's these young German guys. So it's just a human thing.
Yeah.
It's a nice human story.
Yeah.
That didn't happen all the time.
Of course.
But it's nice to reflect on some of those things.
Yeah, and it just goes to show just about war. It's usually the people at the top warring with each other over
Yeah.
borders and boundaries, but
Yeah.
the people who get caught in the middle are usually the young men who had nothing to do with starting the war in the first place.
Yeah. So that's more into this. Books written about that. People can research all that stuff. And there was a Professor Arnold Kramer out of A&M who's written several books about German POWs and here. And so there's a lot of good information and a lot of good research if somebody's interested in that.
Great. I'm going to find those books and link them in the description.
Okay,
You got anything else for us?
No, I think that pretty much covered it. Hopefully, I could go all day long, but I think that we hit the high points on that one. Yeah.
So currently, you're giving tours here on the island, right?
Yes, we give with the Galveston Historical Foundation, we give what's called a Blood and Thunder or Thunder and Blood tour. Now, that's a term that was used in the 19th century for these novels of, mayhem and destruction. So what we concentrate on is 1900 Storm and a lot of gangland murders in the downtown area, where there were just quite a few of them down here.
So that's put on through GHF.
That's put on by the Galveston Historical Foundation.
Awesome. So I'm going to link that in the description as well.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate your time.
Of course. Thanks, George.